Hello and welcome to Racing News 365 answers your fan questions from last weekend's Spanish Grand Prix. To answer your fan questions, I, Nick Golding, cannot do this video alone, and I'm joined for what seems to be always in these videos by 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam Absolutely Peace Coop. Sam, unsurprisingly, we have a lot of questions to answer. Well, I say a lot of questions. We cap it at 5 for every video because we'd be here all week otherwise. But unsurprisingly, the majority are about Max Verstappen, following obviously what happened in the closing stages of the race. But before we dive in to some really good questions, it's got to be said, so thank you everyone for passing them in. Very, very helpful, very kind of you. We got a lot more than 5. It was something like 500, but obviously we only picked 5 of them at random. What were your thoughts, very briefly, on the Spanish Grand Prix?
It certainly wasn't peaceful. I'll give you that much. Do you remember just before the race starts? And I was like, let's have a nice quiet one, lads. You know, kind of nothing to.
Yeah, you jinxed it completely.
I was on the quick hits, and obviously totally jinxed it. With 10 laps to go, you get a safety car, and then it just fell apart from there, really, or came together, depending on how you look at it. It was a moment of madness for Max Verstappen. This kind of mindless reaction to, it turns out, incorrectly being told to give the position back by Red Bull. But again, in that moment, how were Red Bull ever going to know that they were on the wrong side of that and that the stewards weren't going to penalise George Russell? There's so many talking points. Oscar Piastri was fantastic. Really bizarre day on the Ferrari perspective. Nico Hulkenberg got 10 points for a 5th place finish for Stake. It was one of those ones where you're like, oh, this is a bit like, it was a strategy race. It was intriguing from that perspective up front, but it was like, okay, there's not much action, quote unquote, at the front end. There's lots further back, Ollie Behrman and Liam Lawson getting into it, so on and so forth. And then it just, as I said, absolutely came alive.
Now, as I mentioned, that a lot of the questions sent in were about Max. We have also got a couple on other drivers, but the first question comes from Boy It Is, and it's actually about the first of the 3 incidents involving Max Verstappen down the start-finish straight as the safety car period ended and Oscar Piastri restarted the race at the end of lap 60, start of lap 61, and you're putting your glasses on for a very good reason, because the question is, why were no actions taken regarding the Charles Leclerc-Max Verstappen incident after the restart? Because obviously, as we discovered shortly after the race, the stewards announced that they'd be taking no further action.
Yes, so I can explain this because if you listen to our podcast, there was a little bit of disagreement actually between us as to whether or not this was or should have seen a penalty. And post-race, it certainly looked like in some of the wording of the documents, there was some of them that they potentially were looking at Max. I remember you, Nick, was saying, it looks like he could be the one who's in trouble here.
Yeah.
And I was saying, well, I can't understand that possibly because it surely can only be Charles.
Yeah.
What they actually determined, the stewards, was that it was no further action because they felt it was a minor collision as a result of the drivers moving slightly towards each other on the straights, which could have resulted in a major crash. So they said specifically, both drivers were of the view that it was an avoidable collision and could potentially have resulted in a major crash, but neither driver was wholly and predominantly to blame. In the circumstances, we took no further action. So it's that phrase, wholly or predominantly to blame. So the stewards essentially felt, on judgment, we cannot say for definite that is completely that driver's fault. And Ian felt that Leclerc should have been penalised, which I think is a fair enough opinion. This is the thing with these. There's an element of grey when it comes to judging and investigating incidents like these because they happen at such high speed. It's a split second, but ultimately, the stewards didn't feel that either was to the extent that they could penalise at fault, and also, as you say, it was a minor incident, minor collision in the end, but they decided to haul them in front of them to talk about it because, as I mentioned, it could have resulted in something far worse.
Boy It Is, thank you very much for your question. Moving on to the next one, and apologies to anybody if I incorrectly say your name, apologies in advance. Next one comes from Delir. Is Verstappen now more doubtful about his Red Bull future following the mistakes made on Sunday? And of course, what's interesting about this is obviously our colleague, a Racing News 365, Aaron Deck, has discovered actually that Max has a clause in his contract where if he is not in the top 3 of the drivers' standings around the summer, then he can activate a clause which would allow him to leave Red Bull at the end of this season to maybe go somewhere else for 2026. Do you think, Sam, that Max now might be thinking about his future more?
It's a very interesting question. It's a very good question. Ultimately, you would have to ask Max, but that's the obvious kind of statement from that. So we will obviously expand on this situation and what we think Max might be feeling and so on and so forth. I think his non-apology statement that he posted to Instagram was quite interesting because we haven't seen him make those moves in the past. What we have seen is Red Bull uncompromisingly backing him and saying, no, this is our guy. He didn't do anything wrong, so on and so forth. And they didn't really do that last night. And I imagine that Instagram statement was kind of at the behest of the team. They could have said, like, look, Max, we need to get out ahead of this. We need to minimize this. So that might, you don't know how Max has responded to that. That could have maybe kind of made him feel a little bit like, well, how much does this team have my back? And then that can kind of, snowball from there. But in the wider tapestry of things, there's no, in F1, when a driver moves or is looking to move, there's a knock-on effect. We saw that last year with Lewis Hamilton moved to Ferrari. That meant Carlos Sainz was out of a seat, and then Carlos Sainz, being the cork in the bottle, held up the entire driver market for 6 months. And so what we can look at is what the downstream impacts can be. And this idea that Max has a clause in his contract that means if he drops out of the drivers' top 3 of the drivers' title fight, he basically has options. But they're all interlinked because he could go to Mercedes. And the guy who replaces him in that top 3, we imagine George Russell being in 4th, could lose his seat to Max as a consequence of almost overperforming this year. So that's a fascinating element. Another thing that Ian mentioned on the podcast was you have to look at Aston Martin and the whole situation around Lance Stroll. And there's so many question marks as to whether or not they've essentially laying the foundations and the groundwork for potentially moving him out the team at the end of the year, because the team statement before at the point they withdrew him from the race, said that he'd had a flare up with his wrist that he injured in 2023. It's been bothering him for 6 weeks. It's got worse to the point that he needs a further procedure, so we're therefore withdrawing him from the race. But then there's other, there's various, kind of theories and rumors, speculation on the internet as to what actually happened in that immediate aftermath of qualifying in Spain. But one thing I said, so we're essentially told that we wouldn't find out about Lance Stroll's missing the weighing after qualifying until Sunday morning. And as we mentioned on the podcast, I was the person who was doing the early shifts this weekend. So I had texted Fergal being like, "Oh, just let me know what kind of comes up." And he goes, "Well, it looks like we're not going to find out till the morning." I was like, "Well, just let me know everything you know in the handover, and then I'm just fully informed straight away." And then moments later, that comes out, and I text him, I'm like, "Have they just soft launched Lance's retirement from Formula One?" Because it does feel like they are setting the groundwork for Lance to leave. And that could be partly because Max is maybe now in play, and they feel like they have a shot of getting Max or another driver, and they feel that that's what they need to fight for championships in 2026 and so on and so forth. So it's a very long and convoluted answer, and I can see Nick starting to fall asleep. But
what though?
It is part of the wider tapestry, as I said, of if Max is starting to look at other options, what that might do, because ultimately we can't really ask whether or not he's more likely to leave as a result of this, more than the fact that he has dropped from 25 points behind Oscar Piastri to 49 and is far more at risk of dropping out the top 3 than he was a week ago.
Delia, thank you very much for your question. There is one more question on Max. We'll do that now that we've got a couple not on Max. And it comes from David. David, thank you for your question, first of all. I've seen people discussing a comment made by Lando Norris in the cool-down room about Max. What did he say?
So in the cool-down room, they stick a microphone by the three drivers who, finished in the podium position, as we know, and they broadcast it. And so Lando Norris, when they see the incident, essentially says, I've done that move on Mario Kart, in reference to Max's kind of, ploughing into the side of George's car at turn 5. He didn't realize there was a bit of a hot mic moment in some respects, because he didn't realize that that had been captured. And then when he was asked about it later on, he was like, "Oh, you guys heard that? I didn't realize you guys had picked that up," kind of thing. So that's what Lando said, because it was a little bit of a pointed comment, a little bit cheeky, as Lando has been all weekend in Spain. But yeah, very, very enjoyable, an astute observation. Nick, what are your thoughts on it?
I mean, I think it's almost like a subtle fired shot, isn't it, in a little way?
Yeah,
the
it's a
fact
little bit
that
of a dig.
Lando kind of jokes that, yeah, I've done that before, pause, on Mario Kart. So it's, yeah, I think we've seen with Lando, because also obviously in the media pen after the race, when he was asked about the incident between Max and George, kind of jokingly, because George was next to him, kind of jokingly blamed George. And obviously when then asked more on the incident, opted not to comment.
Yeah, very
which
much.
is
It's not my place
interesting.
to say.
Which is interesting, because
it is.
we know the friendship obviously between Max and Lando as well in particular. So maybe there's that element to it as well, and almost not wanting to, talk badly about a mate at the end of the day, which I think is something we can rely to in normal life, not just for the drivers in Formula One, perhaps. So maybe there's an element to that as well, and that his comment was, I think, purely joking. You could tell in the cool down room, but I mean, nevertheless, It's always interesting to hear an F1 driver bring up Mario Kart in a cool-down room. Anyways, David, thank you very much for the question. Now we've got two more, not on Max Verstappen. And the first one is from Claire. And I like this question. What Formula E driver was George Russell hinting at? Seems like Dan ticked him. Now, I will, if it's okay, Sam.
The stage is yours.
The stage is mine. So, long story short, when discussing in the media pen after the race, the incident with Max, George kind of was asked, have you known anything like this to happen before? And he said, effectively, not in Formula One, but in Formula E, a certain British driver. Now, whilst he didn't name said driver, it was quite clearly, I think it's fair to say, hinted at Dan Ticktum, of course, a former Williams and Red Bull Junior driver, received a race ban when he was a teenager for an incident where effectively behind a safety car, overtook multiple cars before taking out a driver who had actually taken him out earlier in the race. Nevertheless, got a very big 2-year ban for it. And obviously, as a result, has kind of had this bad boy reputation, which actually, in my opinion, nowadays is quite wrong, because actually for those who watch Formula E will know he races for Cupra Kiro, who actually used to be a backmarket team, but making huge progress this year, to the point that last weekend in Shanghai, Dan recovered from 21st on the grid to finish 4th and actually claimed his first Formula E podium a fortnight ago in Tokyo. But nevertheless, Dan is an interesting character, it's got to be said. Is very honest and is himself, which is something I quite like about him. He took to Instagram after discovering what George had said about him and delivered, I've got to be said, one of the best responses to a subtle dig I've ever seen, by effectively, in a way, kind of saying not to name names, but George Russell is his name, and in many ways kind of, almost thanking George for, the fact that he's been brought up in Formula One, and even likened to Max Verstappen. As Dan put himself, any publicity is good publicity, and the fact he's being likened to Max Verstappen is a good thing in his eyes. So yes, and it's kind of viewed by the majority of fans as well that George was taking a subtle dig at Dan Ticktum. So who knows? We've got the feud between George and Max. Maybe a brand new feud between George and Dan is on the horizon. Who knows? Time will tell. But Claire, thank you very much for your question. I hope that answers that. Final question, and Sam, I'll let you take the reins on this one. And it comes from Lisa. Is it time for Lewis Hamilton to retire, or is adapting to the car a valid reason still for his current pace?
Thank you very much for the question. It's an intriguing one, and Lewis isn't the only driver who has said that it takes time to adapt to a car. Carlos Sainz famously earlier in the year said he expects it will take about 10 rounds to adapt to his car. And we're 9 rounds in now. So Lewis in theory needs to kind of, get on top of it in Canada, by extension of that logic. I don't think it can be understated how different some of these Formula One cars are from one another. And that's not just in terms of some of the parts they use, because, they all have brakes, for example. But you could have carbon industry brakes, as Mercedes did, or Brembo brakes, as Ferrari do, for example. And the brakes have been an area that Lewis has really struggled with this year. They have very different characteristics. And it's something that after, over a decade of using a different brand of brakes, Lewis is then having to adapt to. Engine braking, which is a method of, essentially braking that is, part of Ferrari's way of managing that process. He didn't ever have to do it Mercedes. So that's another thing he's having to learn and adapt to. So you've got that, but you've also got the characteristics of the car. This isn't a spec series. So they're all slightly different in how they handle and how they're kind of set up and how you can get the sweet spot, the optimum out of it. So it can be incredibly difficult. It can almost be like adapting to new regulations, or an entire new series when you are stepping from one F1 car to another. Let's look at Daniel Ricciardo, for example. He was and he still is, he's a race winner in F1. He was a very successful driver. He almost looked like he could be a world champion. Made a decision to move to Renault in 2019. Again, took him a little bit of time to get up to speed, but he still performed strongly. He moved to McLaren, and then it just totally fell away from him. And he never really quite recovered from that and refound that form. And so Daniel Ricciardo of 2024, when he last raced, was very, very different from Daniel Ricciardo of 2018. And you can kind of like lose that, not because he's lost his ability, but because of he's not gelling with the car, and it's all these different variants and variables that they have to kind of acquiesce with. And that is essentially what you're seeing with Lewis. So it's very difficult to say he's past it. Obviously, age is a factor. It always is. And it comes for every athlete. But it's so difficult to say whether or not it's him or the car or a combination of both. It's probably somewhere between. But also, it's very difficult to say whether or not that is going to still be the case next year with new regulations. It might come back into Lewis's window where he goes, I'm really comfortable with this. So, it's very difficult to say if this will persist. But Lewis has set up, he has laid the foundations for a quote-unquote painful year, as he said a few weekends ago. But he was very, very dejected after Spain in the way he was speaking. He was asked if, and we mentioned this on the podcast, do you think Ferrari can fix this? And he goes, well, probably not, but it's probably just me. Like I'm the problem here. So that is part of the kind of very complex situation at Ferrari for Lewis Hamilton.
I think a point I'll add in this actually as well, because I imagine we'll probably get some comments about it regarding Lewis, is that, okay, yes, Lewis is 40 years old. Fernando Alonso is 43 now, and it is still performing very well. I think the big difference there, which perhaps is outlining Lewis' struggles and decline perhaps maybe more than Fernando, is Lewis, with the exception of maybe one or two seasons, from 2007 all the way to the end of 2021, was at the front. He was winning races in a competitive car, constantly finishing in the top three. His statistics don't lie. Obviously, as a result of the current regulations, the issues of Mercedes have with the car, his driving style not suiting these ground effect era cars as well, it has almost made his decline look so dramatic. Whereas you look at Fernando Alonso and I think as a result, that's probably then, yes, I think age absolutely is a factor. And I do believe he is past his prime. I think that has gone. I think maybe 2021 perhaps was that point. And I think absolutely right. He's past his prime. And I think age for him maybe is a factor. But I think the reason why perhaps the same questions aren't raised to Fernando is actually when you look at Fernando's career, with the exception of Renault, when he was at McLaren the first time, Ferrari for a couple of years, obviously, when he was at the front, a lot of his career has actually been spent in the midfield, believe it or not. His second stint at McLaren, of course, with Alpine, obviously with Aston Martin now. His early days, of course, as well, in the opening years of his career. So as a result, Fernando's never had an entire career at the front as Lewis did up until 2020, the end of 2021. So because of that, I think where we've been so used to seeing Fernando in the midfield, perhaps his performances are actually more not looked at in the same light as Lewis's, and the decline perhaps in the weakening performances isn't looked at as well. Maybe in 2026 that would be an interesting point if Aston Martin do come with a car which can win races. If Fernando, for example, isn't doing that, but maybe whoever his teammate is, then maybe Fernando's age will perhaps show. But I think that's also an interesting point to add into that. Of course, those who are watching this video, be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments on any of the questions we have answered, any further questions you want answering, because we quite enjoy doing these videos. Sam, amazing as always. Please do smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you very soon for another video. See you later.
Thanks for joining us as always.